Hello, my name is Erinn Komschlies, and I've been the Jenni House Artist in Residence here in Whitehorse, Yukon for the month of August. I am a clarinetist. I'm originally from Wisconsin, but I moved up to the Yukon last November. And for this residency, I've been spending the month researching klezmer music, which can loosely be defined as instrumental Jewish folk music, and practicing how to play this style on the clarinet. So in this presentation, I'm going to give you a brief historical overview, including klezmer music's religious roots and how its ties to religion have changed over time. I'll also give you some tips on the specific techniques of how to play klezmer music, and then at the end I'll be playing 4 different klezmer songs on the clarinet. So what we recognize today as traditional klezmer music can be traced back to Eastern Europe in the 17th century, but the roots of the Jewish musical tradition go all the way back to biblical times, and we can learn about that in the Old Testament. If you read the Old Testament, you'll get the idea that the ancient Jews were very religious, and music went hand in hand with their religion. Music was primarily a way to praise or communicate with God or draw closer to his presence. Musical instruments seemed to be used to feel the presence of God. 1 Samuel 16 tells the story of David playing the harp for Saul when he was tormented by an evil spirit. Verse 23 says, "Whenever the spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul, he would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him." When David became king, he instituted music as an official part of the temple worship services. Of the 12 Jewish tribes, the Levites were appointed as the musical leaders. According to 1 Chronicles 23, verse 5, King David appointed 4,000 Levites to be orchestral musicians. In addition to that, there were over 200 singers and over 100 trumpet players. So that gives you an idea of just how large and extravagant these services were and just how important music was to them. The public cantillation of the Torah and prayers were other customs dating from this time. The people would sing the words of Scripture rather than merely recite them because it helped in memorization, and they felt it brought them closer to God. These melodies were generally passed down orally, but there were also a few manuscripts that included markings called trope markings along with the text that showed how to phrase and shape the cantillation. Some ethnomusicologists believe that these chant melodies have been preserved to this day and could even form the melodic basis for instrumental klezmer music. After the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, a period of mourning began for the Jews, and instrumental music was banned. The Jews were forced to wander other lands. Some traveled northward to Europe, and the group that became known as the Ashkenazi Jews formed around the Rhine River in northern France and western Germany. The music that we recognize today as traditional klezmer music mostly comes from these Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews. After facing violence and anti-Semitism, they gradually had to flee eastward, and they picked up musical influences from the cultures they came across. In the 1700s, the Hasidic movement was started, and that emphasized joyfulness and prayer, and song and dance were encouraged. Restrictions from the temple mourning period were eased. Songs with religious lyrics called nigunim became abundant. According to Jewish folklore, the melodies of the nigumen were so entrancing that poor men would rather pay a musician to teach them their melodies than spend that money on needed food. Instrumental musicians took these beautiful religious melodies, set them to faster tempos, and turned what were prayerful songs into joyful dances. Some Jews scorned them for creating a mockery of their prayers, but really, instrumental dances based on the Nagunim showed that religion permeated every part of a Jew's life. And it was around this time that these instrumentalists and their music became known as klezmer. The biggest job for these klezmer musicians was the Jewish wedding. A wedding without klezmer was considered shameful, and musicians were traditionally involved in almost all parts of the wedding, including customs that took place in the weeks prior to and following the ceremony, starting already with the engagement party. The week before the wedding, the bride and groom were not supposed to leave their homes, so the klezmer musicians would play at both homes each night to help pass the time. They also played for the bride's mikveh, or ritual bath, and in the getting ready process the day of the wedding. Solemn music was played for the wedding procession, and after the ceremony, the musicians broke into lively music, leading the guests to the reception site. Slower music was played during dinner, followed by more lively dances. In those days, the klezmer ensembles were primarily made up of stringed instruments. Winds and brass were later added as a result of Jews' service in military bands. Tsar Nicholas I, reigning from 1825 to 1855, hated the Jews, and in an effort to keep them from marrying and having children, he initiated 25 years of mandatory service in the army when Jewish boys turned 18. In the army, many Jews opted to join the military band so that they could avoid combat. There, they were introduced to wind instruments, and they learned to read and arrange music. After their years of service were finally over, some Jews brought back their newly learned winds and brass instruments to their klezmer ensembles. And from then on, the clarinet competed with the violin as the main melody instrument. Klezmer music dwindled in Europe during the World Wars. Anti-Semitism moved many Jews to assimilate to European culture and abandon their traditional music. During World War II, many klezmer musicians were taken to concentration camps, where they had to do slave labor and also perform in camp orchestras for the Nazis' dinner parties. It's estimated that about 90% of the klezmer musicians in Europe died in the Holocaust. While klezmer music was fading away in Europe, many Jews were finding new opportunities in the United States. Between the years 1880 and 1924, about 2 million Jews fled anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, and many of them settled in New York. The rise of the recording industry in the early 1900s in the US was a source of income for some klezmer musicians. Clarinetists such as Naftuli Brandwein and Dave Taras made recordings on 78 RPMs that have provided researchers with a taste of what original klezmer music actually sounded like. This time became known as the Golden Age of Yiddish music. But as the years went on, the Jews in general tried to assimilate into American culture because they felt the need to fit in, and klezmer music faded away. By the 1970s, though, younger generations of American Jews didn't have to worry so much about fitting in. In fact, a movement began that led young Jews to seek out the roots of their Jewish identities. Drawing from those old recordings, which were considered authentic klezmer, they began a revival of Jewish music. The first band of this revival period to record its music was the Klezmerim from California, and they recorded an album called East Side Wedding. This group was inspirational to many others who formed bands fusing traditional klezmer music with popular American styles. A musicologist named Henry Sapoznik was also very important in the klezmer revival. He initiated Klezcamp in New York, which was a Yiddish folk arts program that ran from 1985 to 2015. This also inspired a similar event in Canada called Klez Canada, and that is still happening every year near Montreal. And today, klezmer bands exist all over the US and Canada. Okay. I mentioned earlier that one question I was interested in looking more into was, is klezmer music today still considered religious in any way? There was a lot of dialogue in my sources about this, and in general, most people were saying that the klezmer revival came about because younger Jews wanted to connect with their culture without necessarily connecting with their Jewish religion. Since klezmer is primarily instrumental music without words, some say it's as close as they can get to secular Jewish music. During the roots movements of the 70s, when Jews wanted to find new ways to connect with their ethnic identities, there were three movements that came about. The Jewish Renewal movement involved a revival of a more progressive type of religion without old-fashioned restrictions. A second movement strove to revive Yiddish culture, but abandoned the religion. And a third movement was about a revival of both the culture and traditional religion. The resurgence of klezmer music generally fits into the second category, a desire to connect with Yiddish culture in a secular way. Of course, this wasn't true for everyone, but speaking generally, klezmer since the 70s has been largely secular. This, however, has brought a bit of uneasiness to some Jewish people because in traditional Jewish life, there was no separation of religion and culture. You couldn't have one without the other. The original klezmer musicians of Eastern Europe weren't very progressive, and they still studied the Torah and participated in religious observances. And as I mentioned before, their music originated in instrumental renditions of religious songs and prayer melodies. So, of course, you don't have to be religious to play klezmer music, but I do think it's important to be aware of how klezmer music has its roots in traditional religion. And this led to another question that I had, and that was, do you have to be Jewish to play klezmer music? I was particularly interested in hearing what people had to say about this because I love klezmer music, but I'm not Jewish. Some musicians have defined klezmer music as the musical expression of Jewish identity or the soul of the Jewish people, but many of my sources pointed to the universal appeal of klezmer music and how it draws audiences of both Jews and non-Jews. In the early 1900s in America, klezmer was only played by Jews. But the revival that began in the 70s involved all sorts of people. Several musicians from the well-known klezmer bands of the revival period were not Jewish, but they were still drawn to this type of music. In general, I think audiences are going to be more interested in the music itself than trying to determine if every member of the ensemble is Jewish. This is a quote from a clarinetist from the Charlotte Symphony who is also involved in klezmer music. You don't have to be Jewish to like or perform klezmer music. It has a universal appeal. What special appeal does klezmer music have for a clarinetist? Plenty. There is a total freedom of expression. You can do all the things your teacher told you not to do and not feel guilty about it. And this is a quote from Giora Feidman, who is an Israeli clarinetist, also famous for his klezmer music. We can describe klezmer as a mindset. Whoever shares music from an inner stance instead of reproducing it, whoever therefore understands himself as an instrument of song, is a klezmer. This corresponds to my conception of klezmer. Therefore, one doesn't necessarily have to be a Jew to play klezmer. I am completely convinced that anyone could be a klezmer, independently of where he comes from and in which God he believes. That being said, I do think it is important for musicians to learn about the music that they're playing. Since I am not Jewish, I wanted to spend some time studying the background and history of klezmer music out of respect for the Jewish culture, alongside practicing and performing the actual music. So now I'm going to talk just a little bit about the music itself, and I'm going to demonstrate a few things on my clarinet. So if you hear klezmer music, you may recognize it as sounding Jewish, but you may not know why exactly. And I think mostly that's because the techniques that klezmer musicians use stem directly from Jewish cantorial singing. These techniques include the use of the same modes or scales that are used in Jewish services, as well as ornamentation techniques. There are 3 modes that are most often used in Jewish religious services, and they're still known by their Hebrew names. The names are related to what parts of the Jewish service they're used in. One of these 3 modes is called the Ahava Rabbah mode, and that is Hebrew for a great love. And the scale sounds like this. The second mode is called Mishe Berach, and that means a prayer for the sick. That one sounds like this. Thirdly, the Adonai Melach mode is Hebrew for God is King, and that one sounds like this. So the first 2 scales that I just played both have the use of an augmented second, and that is something that a lot of people will recognize in Jewish music. And so both instrumental, secular klezmer music and the Jewish religious services will make use of these same modes, and that really connects the 2 in sound. In Jewish religious singing, a lot of ornamentation is used to show an outpouring of emotion. And the specific techniques that clarinetists use in klezmer music come from those same singing techniques. In klezmer music, the clarinet is said to mimic the cantor. Perhaps the most important type of ornamentation in klezmer music is called the krech, and that word is Yiddish for sob. This effect mimics a choked off sound, and it typically involves 2 grace notes before a main note. Usually the first grace note will be lower and the second grace note will be higher. The lower grace note should get emphasized, and the upper note, should get choked off. And it doesn't even really matter so much if the upper note is really heard at all, or if you can't tell what exact pitch that upper note was. The whole point is that we're trying to create a sob-like sound with our instrument. And so on the clarinet, that effect might sound like this. So I'm really emphasizing the bottom note, and then I just do a really quick and choked off upper note before I move to the main note. I'm just going to play an excerpt of a melody that will use the krech, so see if you can recognize where it is in the music. Another technique that's important in klezmer music, especially for the clarinet, is a laughing or crying sound. I'll just demonstrate it quickly. So it's that sound you hear at the end of the note that kind of cuts off the note in sort of an aggressive way. So to do that technique, you first have to do a downward slide with your embouchure and practice doing that a few times. A good note for clarinet to practice this on is the high B. So first you just want to get really good at doing that. And then when you want to cut off the note, you want to add an extra burst of air and also close off your throat. So I'll just play this little excerpt again. So if you look at a piece of klezmer music, it will only have the melody, and the ornamentation is left completely up to the performer. If you are new to klezmer music, like I was, the task of figuring out what ornamentation should go where can be pretty overwhelming. And so what I did was I found a recording on YouTube that I liked by Naftali Brandwein, the clarinetist, and I slowed the recording down to 75% speed. You can do that right on YouTube. And then I just transcribed the ornamentation that the clarinetist used. And that was a good starting point for me to be able to figure out what kind of ornamentation to add on my own. And it was a lot easier to learn klezmer techniques by ear from there. So here is a little melody that is probably familiar to you. And you'll notice there is no ornamentation written out. And so first I'm just going to play the melody as written without adding any kind of klezmer ornamentation. And so now I'm going to add in several different types of ornamentation, and you can hear what a contrast it is to the first way I played it. So as you can hear, ornamentation is really what gives klezmer music its unique Jewish sound. And so now I'm going to move into playing 4 different pieces for you. Normally when you would hear klezmer music, there would be an entire klezmer band, but since this project is just me, the accompaniments that you'll hear are all just going to be me on clarinet. So thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the music.